Hi everyone and welcome to the Deakin Alumni webinar with Professor Ken Parry. My name is Farisha Rahman from the Central Alumni Relations team. Today we're broadcasting from the Burwood campus with Professor Parry presenting on the ethics and integrity of leadership.
Hello everyone and welcome. This is Ken Parry speaking. Now I've had a lot of experience in manufacturing industry quite some years ago now, and I'm thinking that you're from all sorts of different industries, but I had experience in manufacturing industry. I was an inventory manager, and I've seen the difference there between public sector versus private sector, two different ways of thinking and doing things, and perhaps two different ways of approaching the sorts of things we're talking about today in terms of ethics, integrity and others. And indeed, even with the private sector, within the private sector, you've got different worlds that people live in terms of manufacturing vis-a-vis the retail nature of private sector business. So I'm making the assumption that you're all representing all sorts of different aspects of our business and non-business society out there. So what I'm talking about is certainly relevant to business, but it's also relevant to our life more in general and our leadership roles in the community in general as well. So most of you are alumni, and thanks for tuning in. I'll be talking. I'll be asking you to reflect on what I'm saying within the context of what you're going through at the moment, what you have been through over the last couple of years or so. So think about those questions that you might want to send in. I've always enjoyed the tough questions because I've got to answer those questions at some stage. At various times there, I was out talking to hundreds of executives at the hotel at lunchtime or something like that. And a lot of my colleagues go, "Oh, I hate the tough questions. They're too difficult for me." But I love them because I've got to answer them at some stage. So you're thinking through some tough questions about ethics and integrity, and I'm making an assumption. I could be wrong. It's been known, but I'm making an assumption that you all experience some sort of ethical or integrity problem or drama, either at work or personally, and you might be going through that at the moment, which is why perhaps you find interest in the topic today. Let's see if I can help you out by talking with you over the next 40 minutes, then we'll have 20 minutes or so of question and answer going on. First of all, let me set the scene by putting leadership within context. What is it and where does it fit and what's going on here? And I've got a model there that's come from an article that Brad Jackson and I put together a couple of years ago, and I think it makes a lot of sense. So what I'm going to be talking about today is essentially that first red arrow, and what leadership does, as it says there, is affect the hearts and the minds of the audience, the emotion and the sense-making of the audience, so the people that you in your leadership role might be communicating with. So leadership is about emotion and sense-making. Now, obviously, I've got three other little arrows pointing to that red arrow there, so that sounds like the major arrow that I'm talking about. I'm not so much talking about the impact upon the bottom line. That's what you, indeed all of us, are ultimately accountable for. We've got to manage all our resources to achieve the bottom line accountability that we're put down there for. Otherwise, we might lose our jobs, for instance. So accountability is important, but problematically, a lot of people go straight from leadership to the bottom line and their accountabilities and make some unethical decisions along the way because they've got to quickly account for the bottom line that they are responsible for. And I guess the suggestion I'm coming up with here is that if you concentrate on leadership accountability for the bottom line, you're being just plain irresponsible. You've got to contribute to and be cognizant of and be responsible for that first red arrow. That's what you're responsible for, to generate the right sorts of outcomes in the hearts and minds of the people you are dealing with. I won't spend too much more time on this model just to put that in context, but when you're thinking about ethics and integrity, I guess it makes a lot of sense, does to me, hopefully to you too, that the ethics, the integrity within which let's make you the case study at the moment, the ethics and the integrity with which you do your job and interact with people has a great impact upon the emotion and the sense making. If people perceive that you don't have much ethics and you don't have integrity and you're not ethical, their emotions will be negative and they are less likely to make sense of what the expectations are for the future. For those of you who might be quantitative minded, for each of those three red arrows, we found from research that there's a correlation of about 0.7 for each of those. So clearly leadership has the strongest direct impact upon emotion and sense making. But if 0.7 is multiplied by 0.7 multiplied by 0.7, we get a contribution to the bottom line of 0.34. That's a correlation with the bottom line of 0.34, which means that about 11% of the variations in your bottom line accountability are explained by your leadership. Only 11%. What it explains greatly is what goes on in the hearts and the minds of the people you are working with. So let's move on from there to try and get a better insight into what we're talking about in terms of your contribution to the hearts and minds. I've got there just the notion of ethical leadership is concerned with integrity. Okay, I've mentioned those two terms. We've got a contribution in action to morally justifiable set of principles and values. Now that sounds great, doesn't it? Morally justifiable. We're all there about morally justifiable, doing the right thing, not the wrong thing. And I guess I want to make the point up front, and I'll elaborate this and you'll keep thinking about it, is that it's not always the good things that you need to concentrate on. Morally justifiable, I'd suggest that all of you out there do the morally justifiable thing almost all the time. You make the right decisions and you're ethical almost all the time. You're right, not wrong in what you say and what you do. And look at the extreme examples I've got down the bottom there. The person on the right was, well, guilty is probably the wrong word, demonstrated behavioural integrity. So behavioural integrity is when you do what you say you're going to do. You make a commitment to people and you go through and you fulfil that commitment and you do exactly what you told them you were going to do. Now the guy at the right, who was the bad guy, his commitments in action were not morally justifiable, not then and not now. He was doing the wrong thing, but what he said he'd do, he came ahead and did it. So he had behavioural integrity. Now the guy on the left is a famous politician, of course, so a lot of politicians are guilty of saying things, but they're not going ahead and doing them. Even this one, we can say he's a recent popular president of the United States. We can say that even he has been accused by others of not having behavioural integrity, of not coming through with what he said he would come through with. So that's one aspect of it. To get that sense making and that positive emotional outcome and get people following you, behavioural integrity is important. But what's equally important is to be seen in that morally justifiable zone, not the opposite zone of the morally unjustifiable zone. Now, everything I'm saying so far is probably pretty obvious to you, but we just need to rekindle those ideas because I might try and shoot them down shortly. Recently in England, I saw a bit about John Wesley, who's apparently the Methodist Church was based on his speakings and writings and messages. He said, do all the good that you can in all the ways that you can, to all the people you can in every place you can, at all the times you can, for as long as ever you can. Well, that all sounds very good, doesn't it? I'm sure we all do that. We'd love to do that. We'd love to not be accused of not doing all that. And I'm sure that you all do all the good that you can most of the time, in most of the ways that you can, to most of the people that you can, for most of the time that you possibly can do it. So I'm thinking the question becomes, I'm giving you a rhetorical question here now. So what? What's the big deal about doing the right thing? What's the big deal about being morally justifiable? What's the big deal about doing good in good ways to achieve good outcomes at all the times that you can? because hell, that's what's expected and that's what we all do anyway. So how can we really stand up and make a big deal about the fact that we're good people doing the right thing? Just a rhetorical question. Think about that amongst yourselves. It might lead to a question you can ask me later. But I'm saying, what's the big deal about doing the right thing when we're talking about ethics and integrity? Because we've already seen a case study back there of someone who partly did the right thing, but partly did the wrong thing as well, and is now known for doing the wrong thing. It's my colleague Sarah Proctor from some years ago in New Zealand, and from the research that we did, so we've actually researched these phenomena as well as just thinking about them and writing theoretically. There's a strong correlation between perceptions of integrity, perceived integrity. I want to make the point that integrity is a perception. It's not an actual thing that you do, it's a perception that other people have. So if people perceive that you have integrity, well, then you have integrity. If people perceive that you don't, even though you might think that you're the most wonderful person in the world, if other people perceive that you don't have integrity, well, bad luck, you're behind the eight ball there, to use another metaphor, and it's going to be tough to try and resurrect yourself from that. Integrity is a perception. Now, I've said there's a strong correlation with transformational leadership and those sorts of perceptions that we'd like to have. Now, there's different sorts of measures of there's different sorts of measures of leadership, and transformational is just one of those. And pretty much all the measures of leadership come up with the same sort of response there, that the more you do leadership, the more you get perceived to possess integrity. However, there are people, could be you from time to time, there are people who do it more often than others, who do the leadership but still are perceived as unethical. I'll tell you very shortly about how we do it and come up with those insights there. But people can do leadership but still be deceiving others, can still be self-serving in what they do, cannot be looking after the welfare of the people they're talking to, and in a sense still doing the wrong thing, even though they are in theory doing leadership. So I'll say again, the perception of integrity is as much about not doing leadership. So from our research, we found if you don't do this transformational or other leadership, we've got AWOL there, if you're absent without leadership. So think amongst yourselves, another rhetorical question. If you're in a position for which leadership is a strong characteristic of what's expected of you, if you are in a leadership position and people are looking to you for leadership and you don't do it, if you go AWOL in your leadership, then people perceive that you can't be trusted, that you're unethical, that you don't have integrity, because you're not providing the leadership that they're all wanting, needing, expecting from you. So not doing leadership is about a negative impact on integrity, but about doing the expected leadership is a positive impact upon integrity. I'd suggest that you can do the right thing at least 95% of the time. It's a bit like what I said before. What's the big deal about doing the right thing? We all do the right thing almost all the time. But it's that other up to 5% of the time where you might make those mistakes, where you might be AWOL in your leadership, where in spite of doing the expected leadership, you make decisions or have actions or interact with people that they don't appreciate, that puts their welfare at stake, and for which they might have put their welfare in your hands and you've let them down. So you only have to do it sometimes only once, and you've lost those perceptions of integrity sometimes forever. Let me give you an example. I had a PhD student some years ago who was researching leadership in the police service. And he found that when people were in a leadership role, which could be just about anyone. So a police officer dealing with other police officers, they had sort of three categories of behaviours. One was the things they had to do, and there was no big deal about that because that was part of the job. They had to do it. So they did that most of the time. The other big chunk of what they did was things they weren't supposed to do, but it was no big deal if they didn't do them. It's a bit like us when we're driving a car and we speed a little bit. We're theoretically breaking the law, but it's not a problem, so no one really worries about it. That's just an example, I suppose. The third example's the big one, though. So from time to time, people in the police service might do something and only have to do it once. And if they do it that once, then they've lost the perceptions of integrity and the following of their fellow officers forever. People will still follow orders, they'll do what they're told, but they won't have that positive emotion, they won't have the sense making, they won't willingly follow what that person wants them to do. And in the police service, that example more specifically was not supporting an officer when they're in a difficult situation. So each officer puts their life in the hands of their fellow officers, and if their fellow officers even once treat that responsibility frivolously, then they've lost the following of their fellow workers virtually forever. Indeed, their fellow workers don't trust them. Indeed, they have perceptions of a lack of integrity and they're perceived as being unethical as a result of doing that. So I've got the difference there. Not doing leadership, doing leadership. And there's a third one coming through there, which is from time to time doing the wrong thing. Now, you might be pleased to know that we actually measure integrity in our research. Down the bottom I've got there some work by Craig and Gustav's done some fantastic work, theoretically, conceptually, and empirically now, putting together what we mean by integrity and try to measure what we mean by integrity. So I've just pulled out a few items there from the integrity rating scale, the perceived integrity rating scale, because integrity, after all, is just a perception. So just cast your eyes through the examples I've got there by which we measure integrity. The person would use my mistakes to attack me personally. That sounds like a negative thing that you don't want to do. The person would risk me to protect themselves in work matters. Sounds like a negative thing that you don't want people to do. Deliberately fuels conflict, falsifies records. They sound like negative things that you don't want people to do. And down the bottom we have a fourth factor or category, which is just some general or absolute indications about a person. They have perceptions the person is vindictive or evil or a hypocrite or lacks high morals or something like that. And those absolute categorizations of the people that are being rated come from their experiences with those people as well. So I've got no doubt you're probably all thinking to yourself, why is it that the measurements of integrity are all about doing the wrong thing and not about doing the right thing? Well, that's the only way we can measure integrity. Remember, I said before, we all do the right thing most of the time. Some of us almost all the time. So the only way to measure integrity is to measure these things that we're not supposed to do, the bad things that I've got there. There are 30 odd of them, and there's only 4 or 5 or 6 listed there, to rate the how well each item describes the person in question, from 1, which is not at all, up to 4, which is pretty much exactly. So you rate how much the person can't be trusted, how much the person lacks integrity, the person is unethical. Now, this could be you we're talking about here. Other people might be using this very scale to rate you. They rate how much this description represents you, and then we reverse code it so we get a measure there of integrity. So if you get a score of 4, which is people think this is exactly what you're like, are reverse coded, you get a score of 0 for integrity. So if you do these things all the time, ergo, therefore, you have no integrity. A lot of people get a score of 1. They do these things occasionally, reverse coded, and they've got a fair degree of integrity. However, we've also found from other research, and from the example I gave you before, and just from you thinking about your own examples, from me reflecting on my examples, it's that from time to time or occasionally when you do these things here, that your perceptions really plummet. Sometimes you only have to do it once. As Craig Roberts, my PhD student in New Zealand, found in the police service, you only have to do it once and you've lost that integrity, which is a perception. You're unethical and you're a person who can't be trusted anymore. That's a good challenge for all of us. So I'm starting to ask you now to think about the thing that you must not do or must never do. I gave you an example before from the police service about what police officers must never do, must never leave a fellow officer in the lurch, so to speak, to using Australian parlance there. You must never leave someone in the lurch. So what is it that you must never do? Because if you do it once, we've found from the research you can do the good things and the right things over and over and over. It doesn't really matter because it's that once that you've done the wrong thing that gives you a score of sufficient lack of integrity, and therefore you can't be trusted anymore. So I'm differentiating here between doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing, and I'm differentiating between doing and not doing the right thing and the wrong thing. And there are things that you must never do. I've got an example. Examples are always good, aren't they? Just recently, not from business, but from my own personal life and my family, there's people who've usually do the right thing and they try and make up for doing the wrong thing by doing lots of little good things. But the good things are just what you'd expect from people anyway. So when they let you down, when you put your life in their hands and they let you down, then they might try to make up for it by turning up all the time, by coming to visit you, by taking you to lunch, by putting on lots of meals and so forth, sending you little text messages, all these good things that people do, like Craig Roberts found in the police service. They're all the things that you expect people to do anyway. It doesn't make up for the bad thing, the wrong thing, the unforgivable thing that people might have done. And I've already asked you to think about the unforgivable, the thing you must never do that will give you the wrong score on the integrity rating scale. Don't even do it once. We won't talk about those now. You might give me some examples on the messages that you send through, but you might keep them to yourself as well. I think you've got a pretty good idea of what these sorts of things might be. Sometimes in the financial sector, people have said something about falsifying records or misappropriating money or something like that. If people know about that and hear about that and you've only done it once, even though you've been a pillar of society, even though you're all happily married with wonderful family and you're a member of different aspects of society that's contributing and you've done all the right things and said all the right leadership messages to all your employees, but if you do this financial error once in the financial world, as a lot of people have told me, then you're finished. Once you've lost a perception of integrity, people won't follow you again. Okay, I'm differentiating here between the right things and the wrong things. The right things and the wrong, doing and not doing, the right things and the wrong things. So at the top there, doing the right thing, that top left-hand quadrant, that's pretty obvious. I've said most of us do that most of the time, so that's not a problem. We understand that. Doing the wrong thing is unethical. Yeah, we know that. And we only have to do it once. And we lose trust, we lose following, we lose perceptions of integrity. Down the bottom, the research has told us, and the more I've thought about it, and hopefully the more you think about it, and the more my other colleagues have thought about it, and the more that thousands of my students over the years have thought about it, it's what you don't do that makes the difference in those perceptions about whether you can be trusted and whether you have integrity and whether you are ethical or not. So not doing the right things has a bit of an impact, as we found from the research. If you're in a leadership position and you don't do the leadership that people are looking for, people start to tick the boxes to say, this person is unethical. I don't think they've got as much integrity as I thought they had. But over on the bottom right, not doing the wrong things seems to have at least as much, if not greater, impact upon generating perceptions of integrity that you would like to have generated by all those people with whom you are interacting. So think about not doing the right things and not doing the wrong things is what we might concentrate on for the moment. And I'm so therefore asking you to think about what is it that you don't do. Okay, not all the things you do all the time, which are good, and I'm saying big deal, no surprise in that. What is it that you don't do that might have that impact that you might have to resurrect as best you can for the future? So on this slide, I've added one more column here, and some people try to engage in supererogatory behaviours. Supererogatory. It was hard for me to pronounce, and I had to look it up and find out what it all meant. But here's the point. Supererogatory behaviours are those ones that are good, right, not expected, above the call of duty, and people do those because they get thought of as highly commendable, and they think that might contribute to following in their leadership role, and they think it might contribute to greater perceptions of integrity from other people. The classic example that's given, a bit of a hypothetical, not a non-work example, is if you're passing a burning house and you hear someone screaming from inside, do you run in and try and save the life of the person who appears to be in trouble in the burning house? And in so doing, do you risk your own life and put your own life at risk by trying to do this really wonderful, good, extra good thing by trying to save this person's life? Now, if you don't do it, as I've got down the bottom, not a problem. No one's really expecting you to have to run in, put your life at risk, perhaps even kill yourself trying to save this other person. But if you do it, aren't you wonderful? That's great. I'd suggest to you it still does not compensate for that wrong thing that you might have done. So if you're the financial person and you've made that financial error, which appears to be done intentionally and has created perceptions of lack of integrity from other people, and you've lost all your following, and then you try and run into a burning building to save someone, it's not going to make up for the fact that you've still done the wrong thing. Let's just think about the people who actually go to jail, the people who do the really bad things like murderers and so forth. So murderers can't be found guilty and then say, oh, I tell you what, I'll do all these wonderful things for the community, I'll save all the poor people, get the homeless people off the streets, I'm going to be a great citizen, I'll help educate other people. The court says, no, sorry, you've still got to be called to account and pay for what you've done wrong. After you've paid for it, then you can do all the right things you want to do, but you've still got to pay for what you've done wrong. It's the same sort of message here. It's an ethical message. So don't try and think that you can do all these supererogatory things and make up for having done the wrong thing. It doesn't work that way. And I'm guessing you can all think of examples where people might have tried that in the past. They've done one wrong thing and you'll never trust them again. They have no integrity, they're unethical, and they've tried to compensate by doing all these wonderful things for you and for others, but it still doesn't work. So I'm suggesting you can probably delete that central column on supererogatory behaviours, going above and beyond the call of duty, doing things that aren't expected, not necessary, because even if you don't do them, it's not such a big deal. I'm not saying don't do them if you get a chance to. That's up to you. That's your call to make. Let's leave it there for the moment, but I'll fill out the rest of it here. So I've made some detail on that middle column. But what's that word for when the size of the word in the visual print suggests the importance of that word and how important it is. I forget what the word is for it. Anyway, here we go. On the left, the good things and the right things, very small font. Not doing them is probably unethical. Doing them is expected, no big deal. So I've got those in small font. The right things is not an issue. We found that from research. I found that conceptually talking to people, from other theory that other people have researched, and from putting these ideas across to thousands of colleagues like yourselves over the years. There's no big deal about doing the right things. You're expected to do that, so just keep doing them, please. The big issue is over on the right. It's the bad things and the wrong things. If you do them, you're going to be found to be unethical. I guess I've kind of made that point. In spite of you trying to do the right thing, even doing supererogatory behaviours and making up for it, you're still going to be perceived as being unethical. And as we found from measuring perceptions of integrity, it's not doing the bad things that give you the perception of integrity and of being ethical. Because remember, from that questionnaire with which we measure integrity, we measure the degree to which people do all the bad things, then reverse code it, which gives us a score of how good people are. So if you don't do the bad things that are listed on that questionnaire, then the reverse code gives you a very, very high measure of integrity. So that's one way, empirically, that's one way to say it's the bad things and the wrong things. Don't do them, which is a contributor to you achieving your desirable outcome of being seen to be or perceived to be ethical and having integrity. All right. Perception of integrity, therefore, I should say therefore at the front, therefore perception of integrity is more about not doing the wrong thing than doing the right thing. At a point like this, we get to the kernel of the situation. Here's the thing that I'm after. Here's the answer to the so what question. Perception of integrity is about not doing the wrong thing more so than doing the right thing. Keep doing the right thing. Most of you do it most of the time. Some of you do it all the time. I'm sure I do it most of the time. Keep doing the right thing. That's what's expected. That's what the job says. That's what people say. That's what the theological principles tell us. That's what the law tells us. That's what the courts tell us. They also tell us, don't do the wrong thing. So that's the challenge that we're all faced with in our leadership roles. And here's our leadership dilemma, the final slide to put these ideas together. Here's the summation. I've taken out that supererogatory column from the middle. So don't have to get worried about trying to make up for all the bad things you've done by saving someone from a burning building or doing something outrageous, outrageously honourable or ethical, because it probably won't work anyway, because it won't compensate for all the bad things that you might have done, if any. So the size of the font there tells us it's all about the bad things, not about the good things. It's about doing or not doing the bad things, and I suggest that bottom right-hand corner for ethics and integrity about leadership, which is what we're about today. The ethics and integrity, I'm not talking about the unethics and the unintegrity of leadership, I'm talking about the ethics and the integrity of leadership. Your dilemma, your challenge is to not do the wrong things. So I say again, another rhetorical question, as I said before, what is it that you must never do in a work or a personal situation, because it will result in people having those perceptions that you are unethical, can't be trusted, and lack integrity? So that is the conclusion I wanted to draw. I guess at that point, I'll say thank you for your time. Thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to hearing what some of the questions might be. Good to see some tough questions. I mean, don't make them really tough, like world peace and things like that, but some tough questions will be good and give me a chance to have a chat and try and resolve bits that I might not have made clear enough at the moment. I'll hand back to Farisha.
Thank you, Professor Parry. And now it's time for our questions, thoughts and discussion time. So I'll give you a minute to type in your questions now. We'll start with a question from Jane. What happens when leaders make a mistake and apologise for it? And how does this impact their integrity rating?
Jane, yeah, good question. We see a lot of that, especially in politics these days, but also in industry as well. It's on the front page of the newspapers a lot. Apologising and try to make up for it. Part of me suggests that the apologising part is part of the supererogatory side of things. You're doing this wonderful thing that people weren't necessarily expecting. I think it's one more of the good things that people try and do to compensate for having done the wrong thing in the first place. And I'm sure there are some people that say, I never did the wrong thing. I didn't realise I was doing the wrong thing, just people perceived it that way. But I better apologise anyway. As I said, it's a perception, so the trouble is those perceptions have already been clouded. Now, if it's one of those little wrong things, like just speeding slightly when you're driving, people might say, yeah, okay, fair enough, you've got away with it, we'll let you go this time. But if it's one of those things that you must never do, and that's the differentiator I was making there, if there's one of those things that you must never do, then all the apologies in the world will not compensate for it. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Professor Parry. Our next question from Glenn. What is it that you must not do? I would say don't lie, but this is the most common workplace poor behaviour I see. It is justified as white lying, necessary for the cause, but it is still lying. Undermines trust and is self-serving, but it appears almost to be acceptable, so common as not to be a problem. Your comments are welcome.
Okay, Glenn. Yeah, good. Good to see good questions coming through. I like that. Yeah, white lies, they're a bit like speeding slightly. It's one of those things where it could be one of those things where you shouldn't do it, but it doesn't really matter that much. It's the big lies that you must never do. And you're all asking, yeah, what are the big lies? Well, my answer is it's up to you and the people you're dealing with and the situation within which you're all living and working that determines what is the sort of thing that must never be done. How big the lie becomes is a factor of who you are, what people expect of you. Do they already think that you're a bit unethical? What is the expectations of them in this role, in the job, in the society? What's the context? Is it financial, business, or is it some sort of community work? So I can't give you an answer to that. And what's more, I won't give you an answer to that. What I'll say is it's up to you to understand your leadership role, who you are and what you're coming across to these people as, how you are perceived by the people that we're talking about here. Then you need to work out what's the big lie as opposed to what's the little white lie. That's your decision to make. That's part of the critical dimension of that very first component of my model up the front there. What leadership is partly about is you understanding what's going on and making that decision yourself. So partly sidestepping the issue there, but Glenn and everyone else, that's up to you to work out what it is that's bad and that you must never do. Okay, Doug?
Thank you. Our next question from Helen. Does the research suggest ways for leaders to restore their integrity once they have been seen as not being integral?
Yeah, resurrecting your integrity. Well, we haven't actually researched that. What we found is that you can destroy perceptions of integrity, and I guess once it's destroyed, it can't be resurrected. I guess you've got to get away, go somewhere else, start again. have a different context, be a different person in a different context with a different group of people, because you can't resurrect it with the same people in the same context doing the same things. There's an issue out there called the organisational psychopath. You might have heard that term. So that's one of the extreme personality aberrations that some people have, the completely and utterly self-serving person. That word psychopath and narcissism, they get thrown around a bit, but those people do exist, and I've experienced a couple of them myself. And in talking about that extreme example, therefore extreme examples of people who lack integrity and are unethical and therefore can't be trusted, when talking about and sharing ideas with the community, I've written newspaper articles, I've been in the media, television and newspapers about this, written articles for professional journals, and I've got feedback letters, written or email letters from people out there who've experienced an organisational psychopath, and they say, thank you for your advice. But what's the advice? Well, the only way you can resurrect a situation like that, of course the psychopath won't fix it up, they couldn't care less, but the only way you can resurrect that situation is to either you go or they go, because the situation will not be resurrected and they won't change, and you'll just still keep on suffering. So I guess the answer to that question, a good one, yeah, good question, is no, you can't resurrect it. You've got to move to somewhere else. If you've done that really, really bad thing that can't be resurrected, no, you can't fix it up. Now, I hope I'm not sounding like I'm dodging the issues here, but this is really what we've found over the years. Either you go or they go, and if you're just one of the followers, might have to be you. If you're in a leadership role and you're not a psychopath, which most of us aren't, you can realise, yeah, I've made these mistakes here. However, these people are still never going to trust me. They're still going to perceive me as being unethical. I've got to go. Got to do the right thing, get the devil out of here, go overseas to the other side of the world, start afresh somewhere else.
Thanks, Professor Parry. Next question. Is perceived leadership integrity impacted by the quality and nature of the leader-follower interpersonal relationship?
I think I know what you mean there, and I guess the answer is yes. Is the integrity affected by the quality of the leader-follower relationship? I've partly already given some suggestions there, and that quality is partly a dimension of who you are, what you represent, what you stand for, which is also a perception that you give across to those people, and they perceive you as being this sort of a person, this trustworthy a person, this good a communicator, and therefore, if the relationship is good, positive emotions come from it, and there's a lot of sense-making going on, I guess you've accrued a bit of positive, what do you accrue there? You accrue some sort of a positive score in the ledger that you can draw from. So once again, it's the little white lies. Good example from before there. I think that was from Glenn, was it? You might give yourself a bit of latitude to do a few little white lies or make a few mistakes. So just because you make a mistake doesn't mean you're unethical, unless your mistake happens to be embezzling $5 billion from the Bank of England or something. But if you just make a mistake, then you can resurrect yourself by having a high quality leader-follower relationship. In spite of all this, in any case, you want to have a high quality leader-follower relationship. It gives you a bit of accrual that you can draw upon. So yeah, the quality of the relationship's important. You always want that to be positive. But any positive relationship can be destroyed. That's why you've got to think about what's the one thing I must never do, because it will destroy that relationship forever. And I've got to move on and go somewhere else, start again.
Thank you. Next question from David. Are there any studies that support these findings across other cultures? In the Philippines, our president has ordered thousands of supposed drug pushers to be executed. yet he still maintains a high approval rating.
Yeah, good point. As always, with most of this research, it's done in English-speaking countries, mainly in North America and in Europe and in Australia and New Zealand. But increasingly, it's being done elsewhere as well. Unfortunately, a lot of it's just the English translated to another language, and sometimes translations can't be as clear-cut as we would like them to be. However, I'm not trying to dodge the issue, but once again, the quality of the relationship is irrespective of the cultures of the people who are involved. So if you know who you are, you know who they are, you know what we're doing here together, you've developed a quality relationship. That's because you know about the cultures and the expectations and the agreed behaviours, which is part of what culture is all about. So you and they all know what the expectations are and what's going on. So I'm suggesting, David, that yes, what I'm saying is just as relevant anywhere around the world, but how it is put into practice and how it is operationalised is very much a factor of the different cultures within which we might be talking about or you might be operating. I mean, let's not forget that even within, let's say, an English-speaking environment, even within the same country, even within the same city, you have different sorts of cultures going on there. I've seen people who've come from the same school, but they come from a different family background, so their expectations are different. So they're actually culturally different because of the background that they've come from. So therefore, people in a leadership role need to be aware of what's going on here, where these people are from, what they're doing at the moment. Is it manufacturing we're doing, or is it public sector work? So even within a so-called similar culture, you have different sorts of subcultures that have an impact upon how you manage the quality of that leader-follower relationship and how you manage people's perceptions. So yes and no. What I say, it works anywhere, but it's put into practice differently in different environments. So thanks, David. Good question.
Thank you. Next question from Ursula. What if the wrong things are perception or accusation only and have never actually occurred?
Yeah, good point. If the wrong thing never actually occurred, it's just a perception. And it could be that some people are out there to manage those perceptions and create the wrong perceptions about certain people because it's of benefit to them. Or it could be just a mistake or an accident or a quirk of fate that people perceive things differently. It could be a problem of place and timing that, let's say, you, in your leadership role, weren't sufficiently tuned into the place and the situation and what those expectations, and that something like this might well emerge. So once you've had a bit of experience, you can see that, it's quite easy for people to do things and for it to be perceived so-called wrongly or incorrectly or differently from how I'd like it to be perceived. So back to the L for leadership, what leadership means is once again knowing those things, but also creating perceptions in people's minds that you are who you want them to think you are and you are who they expect you to be and that you behave according to what you represent here. There's much less chance then of these mistakes occurring and things being misrepresented or misperceived. Yes, a good point, Ursula, but yeah, once again, know your people, know your situation, and you reduce the chances of those things occurring. And let's face it, accidents do happen, but the more you practice, the more you train, the less likely it is for those accidents to occur. Thanks, Ursula.
Thank you. This is an interesting question. How has social media affected perceived integrity? For example, with the burning house example you provided, social media would generally punish someone found to not have rushed into the burning building. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, good one. And perhaps it's something I should have been thinking more about myself over recent years as well. And is social media, I'm asking myself here now, I guess I'm asking you rhetorically as well, is the social media something that Is it a construct of certain people? Is it something that's managed and manipulated by certain people for a particular reason? Or is it just one of those things that goes on out there that you need to be aware of regarding how things can be perceived wrongly or misrepresented? So once again, that's another part of the context within which we're living here. And I'm sure there's a lot of people who are senior managers in major companies who probably lose sleep at night about the sorts of messages that go out on the social media and how they might be represented or perceived. And generally, people are smart enough to work it out for themselves. But then again, people can be bullied by the social media as well to follow a few messages that go out that might have a negative impact upon perceptions of your integrity. Okay, so what am I saying here? It's part of the context within which you operate. You need to be aware of how it operates. You need to be aware of what the precursors or the causes are of some of the conclusions that people draw in the social media as a result of those sorts of messages that go out. I'm not saying that you have to be like the President of the United States and send out Twitter messages, because then you're contributing to the social media. But then again, that's exactly what the President of the United States is doing. He's trying to contribute to and manage the social media to try and soften the edges that might otherwise occur that give him a negative perception, and he wants to turn it around to being a positive perception. So if you're in marketing, you don't want to do the marketing spiv too much to create all the rosy colours for yourself out there. But then again, that's all part of the game these days as well. So I think, use the social media as an ally and one of your tools in your basket there, rather than just always a problem that you can't do anything about. Because it's out there, it's part of life, it's part of your leadership challenge. You've got to do something about it. You can and you will. Yeah, thanks for that. Good question.
Thank you. We're almost running out of time, so we'll answer one more question from Vincent. How do we define what is good? Value systems and judgments and workplace culture.
Okay, yeah, good. Good question. What is good? And that's always a function of what people's expectations are at the time. So what's good here and now is bad at a different place at a different time. Once again, it's when I'm talking about culture, that's part of the cultural characteristics that you need to be aware of. And you need to be aware of what the people you are dealing with are perceiving about what's good and what their expectations are. It's part of that leadership, the L right at the front. It's part of leadership for you to understand what's going on in people's minds and what constitutes good as far as they're concerned, because that's how you're going to be judged. Not by your definition of good, not by other people's definitions of good, but by the definition of the people who are going to make that ethical judgment about you. Yeah, good point. Thanks, Vincent.
Thank you so much, Professor Ken Parry, for your time today and for sharing your experience and knowledge on leadership. Thank you to our audience today. Remember, you can submit feedback to us at Deakin Alumni at deakin.edu.au. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful day.